here with all of you this morning. All right, well, as many of you in this room are probably aware, America is really moving full steam ahead on nuclear. And as an American working in this space, I can honestly say that it's even more remarkable on the inside than it might appear from the outside. Institutional changes at the NRC and DOE that staffers never thought was possible are happening right now. Federal finance is flowing, and new and creative ways of lending to nuclear projects are emerging. Bipartisan nuclear legislation is sweeping across the states. Contracts, 20-year contracts at 2 to 3 times today's operating costs are being signed to restart nuclear reactors in the US. And now developers are teaming up to put together conglomerates that can deliver new fleets of standardized reactors. It's honestly really cool to see. Now, lest I become yet another American flying into Europe to do a premature victory lap, let me say that all of this is extremely fresh. All of the headlines that you see behind me are from a single calendar year. This is not the behavior of a nation that's executing on a long-term industrial strategy. This is the behavior of a country that woke up to a historic opportunity and realized that it was completely unprepared to meet it. This is an emergency response after 3 decades of failure on nuclear energy. Now, when I started working in nuclear back in 2017, it was pretty grim in America, actually. Nuclear plants across the country were threatened with premature closure. We lost 6 gigawatts of nuclear capacity in just a few years. Now, for most of these nuclear plants, they were being outcompeted in deregulated markets by historically cheap natural gas and heavily subsidized renewables. The one that still really bothers me is Indian Point, because it was profitable, it was an extremely energy-constrained part of the country, and it was still closed, purely political. And then Palisades, that was closed less than 4 years ago. So how did we go from this to where we are now? I mean, in the very same year that I started working, Vogtle, the first 2 reactors to enter construction in 3 decades in America, was in big trouble. Its sister project, 2 large modular reactors at VC Summer, had just been abandoned. It destroyed the utility and literally bankrupted Westinghouse. And Georgia's Public Service Commission staff actually recommended the cancellation of the Vogtle project too. Fortunately, against that advice, the PSC voted to continue the project, and it eventually got across the finish line in 2023 and 2024. But at a cost of $35 billion and 17 years, more than double the initial estimates on both accounts. So again, how did we get from closing down perfectly good nuclear plants, abandoning nuclear projects, and barely being able to finish the ones we didn't abandon, to genuinely pursuing a new nuclear renaissance? Well, first, and something this audience is very aware of, especially in light of what yesterday marked, it was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For the first time since probably the Cold War, energy security was prominent in the energy discussion, and nuclear was a part of that conversation. Second is that a decade of failing to invest in the grid and, frankly, bad energy policy came home to roost. Last year, utility rate requests more than doubled. The average electricity bill is outpacing wage growth and inflation in America, and electricity prices are making front page kitchen table news. So Americans are really feeling electricity prices today. And then third, data centers are arriving with an appetite for power that very few people anticipated. We know that advanced compute requires reliable, round-the-clock power, and at an enormous scale. So what you see here are demand forecasts for 2030 that were submitted to the federal regulator that have increased 7-fold in just 3 years. Now, I think it's safe to say these forecasts may very well overstate what is actually going to materialize. You know, most of the data centers, counter to the narrative, don't exist yet. This demand isn't real. These are based on grid connection requests for data centers that haven't even been committed to being built yet. But even if the most conservative estimates here are true, this represents a demand shock that the American grid is nowhere ready to prepare for. And, you know, I'm kind of talking about America a lot, but America is not unique in its failures on nuclear energy. All across the West, nuclear has been successfully built and then turned away. And there's no clearer example of that than Germany. I'm a little too online for my own good, and I noticed that this graph was making the rounds on Twitter a few weeks ago, often captioned with something like, biggest own goal of all time, or worst energy policy failure ever. And honestly, you can see why. It's really sad because Germany built one of the finest nuclear industries and finest fleets the world had ever seen, and then systematically dismantled it. Decades, possibly centuries of clean power just gone. And so Germany was in a pretty ugly position when Russia invaded Ukraine because it had become reliant on Russian natural gas. And it had eliminated much of the reliable baseload and also clean domestic electricity that could have seen it through the crisis. And again, what really bothers me is that they shut down the last 3 German reactors in the middle of said crisis. So what they did instead was they burned more coal and they imported natural gas that was originally bound for poorer countries. I'm pointing out these failures because I think we are at the beginning of a cycle that is not destined to end differently. We have had momentum in nuclear before. We've successfully built nuclear before. And across the West, nuclear industries have been allowed to collapse or even destroyed. And I think an uncomfortable truth is that we would not be in this room. I've been going to a ton of conferences lately with so much energy and optimism and excitement about nuclear. I don't think that any of that would be happening if it wasn't for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, triggering an urgent rethink of nuclear power, especially in Europe, and new demand to sustain that momentum. We did not choose this moment. Nuclear did not choose this moment. Circumstance chose it for us. And that's a real problem because circumstances change. My firm, Radiant Energy Group, conducts comprehensive global polling on public attitudes towards nuclear power. We've done this for the last 3 years, and this is data from our latest survey, which covered 34 countries, representing about 2/3 of the global population. We track support based on age, gender, political orientation, concern about climate. In total, each respondent, there's about 200 variables. And this chart right here is a graph of support among 18 to 24-year-olds and 65 and ups in the 19 high-income countries that we surveyed. And the trend is pretty consistent, that perhaps counterintuitively, the oldest in most populations are the most supportive of nuclear, and the youngest people are some of the least supportive of nuclear. I will point out, because we're in Sweden, credit where credit is due, Sweden is the only high-income country where youth support for nuclear surpasses the global average. So, go Sweden. And this, I was kind of surprised when I saw this data for the first time back in 2023, because as a pro-nuclear advocate, the story that I had always told was, you know, the boomers are just anti-nuclear, they've got their Cold War hang-ups, they have China syndrome, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, you know, there's just too much baggage there. But for young people, they don't have that baggage, and if anything, their Cold War equivalent is climate change, which is why they may be more open to nuclear and more supportive of it. And frankly, I wish that were true. This chart shows the national average in high-income countries versus the support from respondents who said they were very concerned about climate change. And what we see is that climate concern, frankly, does not translate to nuclear support. I now am going to pick on Sweden because there is a 15-point gap there. If you live in Sweden and you are very concerned about climate change, you're a third less likely to support nuclear than the average person. That's pretty concerning. So I'm not trying to underplay the current momentum for nuclear because it is very real, but I think it's a result of crises and favorable economic conditions. There isn't a foundation of strong, durable, broad public support for nuclear underlying that. So what happens when circumstances change? What happens as the energy crisis continues to fade from memory, when governments change, if demand changes, and when projects inevitably run behind schedule and over budget, what then? And I think the scary answer is the history that I just spent the first half of the talk happens then. You build nuclear, you lose support, and you walk away from it. Interestingly, the OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency has, for a long time identified that there is a relationship between building nuclear and nuclear support. The more nuclear you have, the more likely a country is to support it, and the less nuclear you have, the less likely. Importantly, they say, which comes first is not clear. And that ambiguity is sort of the point. These are mutually reinforcing things. But as I pointed out, clearly building nuclear is not enough. And if people in this room and the industry and policymakers are really serious about building new nuclear and replacing fossil fuels and securing energy supply, then we have to be really serious about building support for nuclear first, and at very least, alongside it. I was practicing this yesterday, and I was reaching this point and realized, wow, this is really a downer of a talk. So let me give you something to work with. We know that public opinion on nuclear is not fixed. So we ran a message testing experiment in Germany, anti-nuclear Germany, and we found that actually talking about the waste, talking about how it's managed, showing what it looks like, talking about the fact that a lot of energy remains in spent nuclear fuel and can be recycled, grew support for nuclear. People changed their minds. And there is one area in nuclear where the public is already overwhelmingly on our side. In every single country that we poll, a majority of the population is against nuclear phase-outs. They want to keep the existing nuclear that we have. Europe can and should act on that mandate. More than 20 gigawatts of nuclear capacity was closed across Europe in the last decade. And 9 gigawatts are still on the chopping block, scheduled for closure in the next decade. Now, the UK is on this map. It's not included in those totals because, unfortunately, they made some technology choices. That means their reactors are actually physically degrading, and it will be difficult to extend those lives or restart them. That is not true for most of the reactors on this map. There is no reason that these reactors cannot be rebuilt and be restarted. The technical obstacles are not significant. The economics are extremely favorable, particularly right now, even in countries where substantial decommissioning work has already been taking place. Rebuilding and restarting these reactors represents the fastest and cheapest way to get new nuclear on the grid. And we see this is already happening in the USA with 3 Mile Island, Palisades, Duane Arnold, Indian Point, which they worked very quickly to decommission that, to start drilling holes because they didn't want the possibility of a restart. Holtec says that they can rebuild Indian Point in 4 to 5 years for $8 to $10 billion. That is a political decision that New Yorkers have to make. And I think that deal, whether they choose to pursue it or not, is going to look like immensely good value in hindsight compared to what is coming for New York. And frankly, extending the lives of those 9 gigawatts of reactors is even easier. You just continue to let them run. You make that decision. With proper maintenance and part replacement, we know that these reactors can continue producing carbon-free electricity in pristine condition. Reactors of similar age and vintage across the world are seeing life extensions out to 80 years, and the USA is seriously investigating life extensions to 100 years and beyond. These plants just are aging extraordinarily well. So honestly, I think this is a credibility test for nuclear. Because, I mean, if you cannot do the bare minimum, if you can't keep existing reactors operating, why should anyone think you can do the harder things? And frankly, if you can't rebuild and restart reactors that have existing infrastructure, that are technologies that the world has a good amount of experience with existing workforces, no matter how small, and that use components that can be purchased in international markets today, then why should anyone, including investors, think that you're going to see a first-of-a-kind new project, new build, that's going to have delays and cost overruns through to the end? Now, by definition, this is limited growth. So, extending lives and restarts are a very small part of what a new nuclear renaissance in Europe would look like. But it's a credibility signal, and it's a signal that currently many countries across Europe are not sending. Okay, now I'm going to turn on the serious optimism, because everything that I've shown you today, the failures on nuclear, the fragile public support, all of these shutdowns, none of this is inevitable. These are all decisions, and they're political decisions, and decisions can be made differently, and many already are. I mean, I really don't want to underplay the extraordinary progress that Europe has made in the last few years. I mean, I was listening to the minister talk this morning, and I was just glowing, thinking, I couldn't imagine hearing this in such a casual way 5 years ago in Europe. It's incredible. Real capital, real political capital was spent making these decisions. And I know that people in this room have been working very hard and contributed to these wins. So to anyone who has been working in nuclear policy in Europe or had their hand in this, thank you, and please keep going. Like I said, there is nuclear capacity sitting today that can come back online and can actually help grow the workforce, restart the industry that we know we're going to need to deliver on the next fleet of new nuclear reactors. Now, to the industry in the room, please, I beg you, stop thinking that this technology can speak for itself. Massive historical victories, build-outs that we would be blown away by and immensely proud of if we could pull off today, did not prevent a basic 3-decade-long dark age for nuclear across the West. Invest in engaging with the public. Work extraordinarily hard to make nuclear something that people want and are choosing rather than something they feel like is being thrust onto them. And part of that is about engaging and using the advocates that we already have. So to anyone involved in think tanks or foundations, I think building public support, particularly among young people and women, is so underfunded compared to its immense relative importance. If you want nuclear to last beyond this window of opportunity, that's where the big leverage is. And it's also where my biggest source of hope is. I'm very fortunate to sit on the board of Stand Up for Nuclear, which is a grassroots advocacy organization that works on activating global leaders and helping grow pro-nuclear movements and help them take root. These are all pictures from stand-up events that have taken place across Europe. These are people who are already out there making the case for nuclear, talking to people in their communities, talking to their elected officials, speaking in their own language and often like in their free time, outside of work, because they think this is the right thing for their country and the right thing for the world. And you'll notice that a lot of these people are young, and there's a lot of women involved, and some of the demographics that we know the nuclear industry has not won over yet. So I'll just end on this, that we are in a moment for nuclear. This is a moment, but moments pass, and what stays is the foundations that we build while we have the moment. So yes, please, let's build nuclear, but let's also build the support to make nuclear enduring so we can protect what we build and build even more of it. Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting, good presentation. My name is Satomori. I'm from the International Energy Agency, but this question is more from as a Japanese national. So I saw the support to the nuclear based on the generations, and I think that in the case of Japan, I think that the younger generations are more supportive, a lot more compared with the aged people. You talk about the need for climate change, but I think it's also coming from their concerns about their economic future and job opportunities. So in Japan, what we are seeing right now is the substantial price gap in electricity amongst the regions. So the regions in the West, who have already successfully restarted the nuclear power plants, their electricity prices are much lower compared with the eastern part, where they have not seen any state successfully restarted at a substantial scale. So I think that for the young people, it's not only about the climate concerns, but more to do with their concerns about their economic future. So I think that's also a very important element, because at least restarting the continued lifetime extension of the existing nuclear power plants are by far the cheapest and the securest the electricity, even despite the much price declines for the solar PV. So thank you very much. But I think that that's my observation. If that's any help, thank you.
Yeah. No, I take your point. It was interesting. I grabbed dinner with a friend last night who works on nuclear energy in Sweden, and he said that the polling that's done locally has been quite shocking to him, where a few years ago, young people, I think he said 15 to 24 in Sweden, 54% said that they were concerned about climate change. And the latest poll shows that number is down to 15%. That concern about climate or listing it as a top priority for young people has just fallen off a cliff. And I think that's, to your point, if affordability and reliability aren't in place, it's hard, and security, then it's hard to keep that concern for climate. I also take your point that the data here really surprised me too, and I think my best offer for an explanation of why it feels like younger people are more supportive, but it's not being reflected in national polling, is that, in the 60s and 70s, being anti-nuclear for that generation was really an elite project. You think about the people who were involved in no nukes and the institutions, and it was sort of the most highly educated, the wealthiest people who were really driving that. One of the things that we're trying to analyze in our data is how does income and educational level affect these numbers? Because it may very well be that for highly educated, elite, young people across the West, that they are more pro-nuclear than their peers. Certainly that would be a more positive outlook than what this shows, because those typically tend to be people who become decision makers, policy leaders in industry, but that doesn't mean we can ignore that a vast majority of the public doesn't share that same level of optimism and support for nuclear. So I think there's reason that this may not match up with anecdotal evidence, specifically for people who work in nuclear, but something that we need to be monitoring closely.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I'd like to add something. Great minds think alike. We've also done, at the Anthropocene Institute, polling with Eco America, and we find support consistently increasing in the last 7 years. But I don't think there's any mystery in why the youth so often are worried about nuclear, and that's just, you look at the curriculum, which was modified in the 1970s and 80s because of the fear of the arms race, and the quality of information on nuclear chemistry is very low. And basically the teachers just say, what about the waste? Oh, we can't stand the waste, and that's kind of where it ends. People are very concerned for their health, and they should be. That's why I lead with health, because getting rid of fossil fuel is a million times better benefit than any harm posed by nuclear energy. It doesn't take long to explain that, but if nobody's explaining it, then people don't know.
Well, and Carl, to your point, I was an environmental sciences and political science major. The only exposure that I had to nuclear energy in my curriculum was a single day in class, and we watched a documentary about Fukushima. And that was it. And I'm fortunate to have discovered nuclear totally outside of my institutional education. But I just interviewed a new colleague at Stand Up for Nuclear. She's 23 years old, graduated, involved in Citizens Climate Lobby, is passionate about solving climate change, and hadn't heard of nuclear. She speaks French, she studies French. She had no idea that France was decarbonized before decarbonization was even a goal. So to your point, I think education is an extremely underinvested in advocacy moment for the nuclear industry, where if you can talk to teachers, talk to students, figure out how to introduce nuclear early, which is great for the industry too, because it helps build a pipeline for a workforce, that the industry needs to be far more proactive than it has been. And I think that policymakers and foundations can help support that as well.
Yeah. One point I often throw out is just, the only nuclear accident with serious casualties was Chernobyl. And had that plant been built as a coal-fired power plant instead of nuclear, it would have killed 100,000 people. For sure, not an accident, because that's what coal plants are supposed to do. They just kill 100 people a year per gigawatt. And if it's a nice Western one, Eastern European coal plants are worse. So the highest estimate of Chernobyl's accident is 19,000 people. That's crazy. It's probably 60 people. But killing 100,000 people on purpose instead of 19,000 by accident, it's really clear what's better for your health.
Thank you so much. I think we have another question.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. Guillaume Puravet from System, one engineering company in Europe. I fully agree with what you said regarding the support for nuclear, especially amongst the young population. One concern we will have in the near future will be the ability also not only to have the support, but the willingness to contribute to the workforce. And as it was mentioned by our colleague from Japan, what we can see is more or less sometimes the willingness of the people to be part of the nuclear will be the ability to have a future. And as we had lots of uncertainties until now, and it's the case in some countries in Europe, for some people and some young people, the main concern will not be environment and the difficulties of the safety of nuclear, but will it be possible to have a work for 1 or 2 decades, and what will be my future as a future employee? It's not so easy, and when we see the potential of nuclear in Europe, especially in US and some other countries, we need to be very cautious with the ability of our industry to deliver the projects with enough people to do so.
I mean, I think nuclear is so incredible in that it can deliver on this issue of affordability and, you know, job security in a lot of different ways. Obviously, abundant, affordable, reliable, clean power enables all sorts of new industry and economic activity and potentials for growth to create jobs. But also, reigniting an industry like nuclear that requires tradespeople, engineers, you know, hopefully comms people as they continue to do public engagement. I mean, this is a huge opportunity to say, we are going to invest massively in our future, massively in infrastructure, massively in reindustrializing. Please, young people, get on board for good, high-paying jobs that you can support a family on and can deliver so much good for your country. I think it's a totally winning message that I just don't hear the industry making. And again, I think the idea is, well, you know, it speaks for itself, but if you're not hearing about it in school and it's not a cool topic, and unless you're deep in the forums of Reddit, you might not even know about the nuclear industry in your country or that. I mean, I'm from Illinois. I was born in Chicago. We have 6 nuclear plants flanking us on almost all the sides, not the lakeside. 11 reactors. Our electricity has been carbon-free in northern Chicago area for 40 years. I had no idea. My family has no idea. My grandparents lived smack dab in the middle of 3 nuclear power plants, and I spent every summer there. I had no idea. So I think saying, well, you know, they'll come to us. I think we should be going to young people and making the case that there's a lot of reason for optimism, and we can provide the security, the stability, the jobs, and the outlook that they're searching for.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I would say, I went to an environmental meeting with like Al Gore and all these people in Detroit, and I said, isn't it great? There's a fully decarbonized modern economy 5 miles from here, and hardly anyone could figure out what I was talking about. But Ontario is another great example of a fully decarbonized economy. I think, though, if you're trying to get people to respond about nuclear energy, and you don't mention the fact that it could be cheaper, and you haven't even tried to communicate. The best thing about nuclear energy is it is 1,000,000 times more power dense than fossil fuels. And if you leave off a few zeros for safety, you can easily be 10 times cheaper than fossil fuels. And if you think through how that changes the entire economy, all the sticky problems people are worried about turn out to be bonehead simple if energy is 10 times cheaper. And we're not even making that argument.
Thank you so much, and I think we have another question waiting right here.
Yes, grid stability. A lot of people with a big credibility about helping Ukraine are at the moment talking about that we should do like Ukraine does. They do a lot of distributed small-scale electricity production, basically because they are trying to stay alive and Somalia style keep their grid alive. And they say if they just didn't have the nuclear power and only had the renewables, they should be less vulnerable than they are today. And how, which is basically not true. You know it, I know it. I've seen their reactors going in island mode all the way down to 45 hours to at least supply some energy to their cities. Wind power thing doesn't produce anything there. And how can we stop this misinformation, because it's huge in Europe? I've heard it in the European Parliament, I've heard it in the German Reichstag. How can we stop people spouting this nonsense?
Well, you're asking two Americans, so.
I will say I'm not a big fan of wind power. I think it's usually too subsidized for us to have any clear idea whether it works. But I did invest in wind power in Ukraine because it was the beginning of that industry there. They had a big market, and those are still operating, and I think that's probably working out well. I would have preferred to invest in nuclear, but there was no investment vehicle. I think stability, if you want to understand why grids go unstable, first thing to do is follow the money. Who benefits when the grid goes unstable? And you'll find out there's a lot of people willing to run natural gas peaker plants and charge, when the California grid goes unstable, they get to sell tiny amounts of gas for fabulous prices. And there's actually a casino, the regulatory authority is called CalISO, but I call it casino, because they sit around watching the clouds approaching the wind turbines and the solar facilities, quenching them. And then they can sell little bits of gas for beautiful prices. And you wonder why it happens that way. Just follow the money.
Thank you so much. I thought I saw one more hand. Here in the front.
Hi everyone, Thea Görmanen from We Planet. Madi, I wanted to ask you about this polling. Was there like a category of uncertain, like people could say that they're not sure whether they support nuclear energy or not? And was that, among people who said that they were uncertain, was that bigger in the group of young people? I'm just curious to know whether they were more uncertain about their stance.
No, so this data, there was a don't know. So what this is showing is net support. So support is being either, there was very strong, not sure, weakly opposed, strongly opposed. So this is just support. This doesn't include don't know. And what I found interesting is that the don't knows across, so we've done this same poll now for 3 years. The don't knows are shrinking for fossil fuels, but actually increasing across all clean energy technologies. So counterintuitively, more people are saying they're unsure, both about nuclear, but also about solar and wind. Don't knows are shrinking in terms of gas with carbon capture and storage and biomass. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. Another interesting thing about don't knows, and stop me if any of this is just blabbering, but we know that women in polling generally are much more likely to answer don't know than men are. And we find that same thing to be true in our polling, that women are far more likely to say they don't know about something, even if they answer. We have, it's a basic knowledge question about nuclear, just saying, do you know what fuels nuclear reactors? Even if they are more likely to answer that question correctly, they're more likely to say they don't know if they're correct on it or don't know about nuclear. So also just addressing that as a gap is sort of an interesting project in and of itself.
Well, it's not really surprising to me that men are more confident that they know something. I think we all know that.
I saw all the women in here kind of like...
Well, I'd be more likely to say I don't know about renewable energy than I was 10 years ago, because we've had all this emphasis on it, and then we had the biggest coal use year ever last year. Mm-hmm. So
I have a question for Carl. I'm so happy that you brought up climate interventions. a lot of young people. There's actually an organization dedicated for climate intervention found in Finland. It's the young people driving that we need to do something. We need to aim for rehabilitation and not just keeping what we're out. But there are a lot of people now saying that we shouldn't even look into it because it's too dangerous, and trying to forbid even scientific research of this topic. Is Anthropocene Institute working on talking to decision makers? Because I think there's a serious risk. James Hansen even raised this. He was talking at the University of Helsinki a few months ago, and he raised this issue that there's a risk that we'll actually ban this technology before we even try to use it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a psychology thing where people who are fearful act like a rabbit or a deer in the headlights and stop the world, I want to get off. They just want to not do anything and keep anybody else from doing anything as well. That's a very dangerous thing. Panic is dangerous. Now, it would be nice not to do any geoengineering, but we've had about a century of the fossil fuel industry intentionally geoengineering our climate, especially countries in the north that figured they'd like it warmer. I think there's been a plan to melt the Arctic so that ships can go through there, and maybe we don't need the Suez and Panama canals anymore. I think there are people with icebreakers who would like to see that happen. So it's not an accident the planet's warmed up. But I'm a big believer in what they teach in Japanese elementary school. Clean up after yourself. And we can reduce the pollution that we put in the atmosphere. Not with fossil fuels, but we can run the fossil fuel reaction backwards just fine if we have a fuel that's 1 million times more energy dense. And there's other intelligent things we can do. We can probably capture all the carbon that we need to out of the climate simply by making sure the ocean plankton is able to absorb all the carbon that it would like to and would be able to if it had all the nutrients it needs. Iron in particular. It's been said if I had a tanker of iron, I could create an ice age. And that's probably true, but that kind of intervention needs to be done carefully. And my guess is the stable climate used to be the work, perhaps intentionally, of the whales. Whales have an odd practice of going to the bottom of the ocean, eating, and then going all the way to the surface and poop. And that poop supplies all the plankton all the nutrients that plankton needs. And that's why the sailors before the whaling era reported the ocean was not green or blue, but orange with all the bait fish. And, whales, I don't know, they're pretty smart. They've got giant brains and a worldwide communication network, and I bet they learned to farm the plankton. So we can do that too. If all we need is whale poop, we don't need to bring the whales back right away.
Thank you so much. Please give me a warm hand for our